See, I tricked you there. You thought I just fucked it with my editing, yeah? But hey, it was a ruse all along. Got
Ha! Got him! Got him!
Anyway, last time I left you spookmeisters with a series of theories and reasons as for why we as humans may seek out horror media despite the fact that it seemingly flies in the face of all human evolution. Again, there's no real rational reason I can give you as for why anyone would intentionally want to expose him or herself to a scenario that has the very real potential to activate the hypothalamus in its hormone production and the overstimulation of the amygdala, with the potential subsequent disconnect between the right and left-hand sides of brains, resulting, again potentially, in long-term memory ill processing. Knowing what we do know about that on some sort of subconscious and animalistic level, that fear response is negatively valenced, and frankly, not a good time. Hey, speaking of spooky, scary skeletons, why would we seek out horror? Well, I mean, most obviously, and luckily enough, it is a fairly easy question to answer, is it not? Humans are highly illogical, and we do not always need to be rational or need a rational reason to expose ourselves to the spooky nor the scary. While I explained in the previous video the type of emotional states that may encourage one to seek out frightening or exciting media, this video will, in contrast, be assessing the stable traits that we see across individuals that may explain differences across groups in terms of why we use and why we interact with horror. I often speak about statistical averages when I talk about groups, and everyone knows, being the goose-stepping Nazi I clearly am, that of course I love to break everything down into groups and then put them into camps. Haha, just kidding. It's not to put them into camps, but it is because you can break almost anything down into group clusters. Welcome to social psychology and enjoy your stay. And if I do occasionally turn my long-form shitty analysis of things about human psyche and how we interact in groups and with our social psych up a little bit too high, up a little bit too close to 11, and make it a tad too graduate level in my analysis of social psychological questions, then I highly suggest you go and watch Dr. Lehman's recent video on group psychology as a general primer. Lehman does an excellent job, certainly one I would say I have been incapable of doing properly, of explaining the basics and the academic history of group mentality research. Honestly, his video should be my channel trailer. Like, watch this before you climb aboard Aiden's Wild Ride, or that kind of thing, I suppose. And I guess I have to admit you should go sub to him if you haven't already. He is my senpai, and it is important that I pay homage to him. Also, there you go, Lehman. Really though, guys, obviously I love Dr. Lehman, and if you are not subscribed to him, check him out if you want more social science. Anyway, today we're talking about traits. Those are the individual differences across groups. The awesome thing about statistics, though, is that, once I get enough people together with similar traits or shared traits, I can then just take those people and put them into another group. I can still break them all down into a nice, easy, neat numerical value. Gee, I love stats. I can't think of anything else that allows me to turn the complexity of the human machine into a mere data point in a chart. But yes, traits. Since we know that our emotional or affective states can alter our proclivity to seek out horror more or less, it makes sense thereby that our long-term and consistent behavioral and personality-based traits, these things that last over time, would of course also play a role in why we engage with media that has the potential to actually scar our brains, and I do mean pretty much literally, given that we know that exposure to scary shit can cause permanent damage or alteration to brain function and processing. So the question then becomes, what kind of traits differ across humankind that may make one more or less prone to seeking out terrifying media as a form of entertainment? And, well, the first is of particular import to me, as well as pretty much the most thoroughly researched and assessed trait in this area of analysis, and that's this, simply gender. Yep, that's right. Imagine my fucking shot. Men and women are fundamentally different on this, as they are on, you know, all kinds of things. It's almost like, weirdly, we're a sexually dimorphic species and that we have disparate pleasures, desires, and hopes, dreams, and fears. Just on average, you know. I mean, oh shit, oh wait, oh god, that set off the fact alarm! The reality police are gonna come for me now, lads! But really, considering the last video was at least for a period of time deemed not advertiser friendly, can you imagine how quick this shit's gonna get hit as I start dropping, well, completely milquetoast purple pills about the obvious genetic differences between the sexes? Anyway, yes, it is true. We find over and over again that women are simply less fond of horror than men are, on average, in general. There are numerous reasons or hypotheses for why this may be, but perhaps the most readily available, if we want to attempt to make sense of this difference, is the mere fact that women tend to be more nurturing, more caregiving, more prone to communality, given their evolutionary position as mothers and caretakers. That's not a fucking bad thing, by the way, ladies. It's just a reality. That's how we tend to be on average. And of course, I am only ever speaking about statistical averages. None of this information has anything to do with an individual person. If it did, I would not exist. But what that does mean, though, is that women tend to be more averse to seeing more violent scenes. See Cantor and Riley, 1982. They don't tend to like seeing violence. And in contrast, for example, women do tend to like horror films more when the violent scenes from those horror films were just totally removed. See Barry Gray and Donnerstein, 1999. Women also tend to like horror films more when there is a moral or a just ending, and we'll have a little bit more on that. Save it for the end. Males, then, are more likely than females to describe horror films as making them feel uneasy or disturbed. While, in comparison, females are more likely than males to describe horror as making them feel vulnerable or horrified. And that makes some sense considering that the majority of victims in horror films do tend to be females, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. Even though men enjoy horror films, we also are going to feel a little bit more when we see a woman in danger than a man. That's a whole fucking can of worms I'm not getting into right now. But, as we might expect then, males also report having lower physiological responses to horror than females. Men say, horror doesn't bother me. Interestingly enough, though, when we bring in less of the self-report and more of the harder research that actually assesses bodily responses to this, to see the difference between self-report and actuality, we do find an interesting difference there. That is, specifically, regardless of gender, humans tend to kind of fall into these categories of repressors or expressors in their emotional reactions to media exposure. For this, he sparks Palaccia and Irvine, 1999. Interestingly, while males are more likely to be repressors and avoid external expressions of their emotions than women, who tend to be more emotional, more expressive, and more neurotic, and more emotionally expressive. Oh shit, that's the stuff that got James Damore fired once again. Ultimately, though, what Sparks, Palaccia, and Irvine found is that regardless of gender, there was this cross-gender similarity in our response to horror based on our propensity and proclivity towards repression or expression. Basically, even though we have these natural proclivities, we can still be more prone to repression or expression based on our individual traits. That is, individuals who are more prone to emotional repression expressed more enjoyment of a horror film, yet also had a greater physiological reaction when the researchers assessed galvanic skin response, that's GSR, being essentially your hair standing on end. In contrast, individuals of both genders who openly expressed more emotions, who were expressors, were less likely to both enjoy horror films and were also less expressive of the physiological response through the GSR instrumentation. The galvanic skin response meaning we actually measured, are your hairs standing on end? Are you actually expressing a physiological reaction to this film? That's very interesting, at least to me, in that it indicates that men, generally speaking, although of course not exclusively, and it's not a predictor for any individual, are simply more aroused by horror, there's that word again, than women, both psychologically and physiologically. But that other traits can also help explain the differences across the gender's proclivity towards horror to help understand why we might see individual differences. Similarly to this finding, Oliver Sargent and Weaver, 1998, found that males who expressed more traditionally feminine gendered norms towards communality rather than more traditionally masculine agentic norms were less likely to enjoy horror films. And in reverse, in contrast, females who expressed greater agentic norms were more likely to enjoy said horror films. That means that even when accounting for biological sex, masculine, dykey women and feminine new males were more prone to react to horror in line with their gender expression rather than toward their typical sexual norms. But, again, this goes into individual traits. Although we do find these large swaths of the population that tend to fall into, yes, men are more likely to like horror than women, and women are less likely to like horror than men, we do find exceptions to the rule all the time. But outside of those who are more prone to behaving and reacting to media in a manner more similar to the opposite gender, generally speaking, yes, one last time, women and men, on average, simply respond to horror differently and are more or less likely to like it based on their biological sex. And you know what? There may be some very real evolutionary social psychological reasons for that. There is a great study that I love, and I remember when I first read this study, I was still a little bit more blue-pilled, so I had this kind of instantaneous negative response response to it because I thought, that can't be true. I'm a woman who loves horror, this can't be realistic, but as I've gone through and gotten more into both social science and become more red-pilled, I like this study more and more. And as such, I'm going to describe it in detail because it fascinates me. It was conducted by, again, our old friend Dr. Dolph Zillman and his colleagues in 1986, of course be cited below, and it assessed exactly how this difference between male and female in their assessment of horror may present itself or operates in the real world. How do people actually watch these movies together? After all, let's think about this whole horror thing a little bit more logically, or actually, to be quite accurate, let's look at it a little bit more financially. If horror was really only enjoyed by men and maybe by a very small set of dykey women who are repressors over expressors, women who do not express, women who are more agentic and express more masculine rather than feminine norms, women who, in many senses, are reacting in a completely contrary nature to the general nurturing and caring behavior that is inherent to women, well then horror films wouldn't fare very well in the theater then, would they? I mean, they wouldn't maximize their profits. I'm not saying that, of course, there aren't films that generally just appeal only to men or only to women. Of course they are, and for whatever reason, although it's always wrong if there's a movie that's highly male-oriented, if there's a movie that's highly female-oriented, no feminist has a problem with that. Who is complaining about The Notebook, after all? But if you want the biggest bang for your buck, and horror movies do tend to cost a decent amount of money if you want decent special effects, you probably should try to appeal to the greatest audience possible. In fact, if that was the case, that horror is only meant to appeal to men, why would the vast majority of Western horror films be aimed seemingly at teenagers, who tend to go watch them in tandem with their significant other, typically, although of course not always, of the opposite gender? Well, the answer is really not that complicated when you start to think about it, is it? Of course, the man takes his girlfriend with him to see a horror film, so that she will jump at the frightening image that disconcerts her and her inherent proclivities towards nurturance, and have her leap straight into his arms. And if you think that previous statement was sexist, well, hang on to your butts, friends, because science is about to get really sexist on that booty. Zillman and his colleagues conducted an experimental design to analyze how men and women respond to horror in a dyadic co-viewership environment. Let me explain. That is, the researchers hired both a male and a female actress, what's called a confederate, no, not that kind, to interact with subjects while they watched horror films together. The actors, again both male and female, had 3 different emotional conditions of behavior that they needed to enact during this dyadic interaction. Either brave and unresponsive to the film, relatively nominal and normal with some level of jumps or scares in response, or extremely terrified and highly responsive to the scares of the silver screen. The forwarding results were, to say the least, illuminating of the evolutionary nature that horror has on the psyche. That is, female participants who watched a film with the actor confederate when he acted like a pussy bitch hated both the film and expressed a pretty great dislike of the male actor when he was particularly afraid of the film. And in contrast, they liked the film the most when the male Confederate actor acted brave and unresponsive. And they liked him more too. In comparison, and quite the opposite, was evident in the male subjects with their female actor. The male subjects liked the film and their partner less when she acted ambivalent and brave towards the movie, and enjoyed both the film more and expressed greater liking of the female Confederate when she acted terrified of it. Whew, I fucking love that study. That's so illuminating. What this means is that, well, what a fucking surprise. Humans are a product of our social evolution, and horror is just a particular method of gender role expression. This is really a tribalistic, a very old school, males acting brave to entice the female. Me strong man, me make lady very turned on by not being afraid of representation on a screen of something potentially terrifying. Essentially, taking your gal pal to the cinema to watch a scary film is the modern day equivalent of wrestling a member of another tribe to protect her from a rape. The male, in his bravery, as minor and unremoved as it may be, is displaying his bravery by repressing his fear towards the media expression, despite how much physiological galvanic response he may actually be experiencing, meaning his hair really is standing on end. He is doing this to impress the female within this dyad, who is more likely to be terrified and to dislike the media and like him more when he stands up and acts unafraid. Horror films, therefore, are, as a product of our co-viewership, a rehearsal of traditional gender roles which are completely normal and natural to human evolutionary social psychology. Wow, Aiden, you filthy sexist, you say. That doesn't describe me. I'm a woman and I love horror, you unlikely shout at me. Well, hey, guess what? Me too. That's why, as with all things, these are just averages. They're not determinants. Merely, well, yeah, averages. So if we know that women are less likely than men to enjoy horror, why then would a woman such as myself love horror so much? This is a question that I have muddled over for years as I began to examine this realm of research, beginning myself primarily with the theories that led me into the state-based reasoning and knowing that male and female differences in horror preferences existed. Although, as I did mention earlier, the more masculine agentic women are more likely to enjoy horror, so as with all things in social science, we already know that gender is not a determinant. It merely leads to proclivities. But again, why would a woman, like myself, enjoy horror as much as I do? I don't know if you guys follow me on Twitter, but for example, just the other day, as I started listening and learning about this sort of new trend that there's been of feminists trying to infiltrate the Warhammer 40k community by acting like, oh, 40k is so sexist, it's so horrible and discriminatory. That exactly made me want to start actually looking into 40k because it's a series I have always known about and known a little bit about, but not really gotten into lore-wise. Well, the second I found out about the absolutely terrifying body horror that goes into creating a space marine, I was all like, sign me the fuck up. This terrifying shit gets all of my engines revved up. Why am I like that? Why would there be women who would have tastes that don't seem to make any sense from our general evolutionary social psychology? Well, as I've already described, both men and women can be repressors or expressors, and repressors are more likely to enjoy horror while experiencing greater galvanic skin response. I would consider myself very much a repressor of emotion, but that alone is not the only reason why a woman, or frankly any person, may be more or less drawn to horror. While gender is a factor, it is by far not the only factor, just probably the most well-researched one. The other major factor that I would propose based on extant research to be the most researched, or second most researched, trait-based reasons for being attracted to spooky, scary shit outside of gender is sensation-seeking. See Edwards 1991. Sensation-seeking is a trait, again meaning a long-term, potentially lifelong-based factor that simply describes individuals who want to experience more unique and often intense sensations. Individuals who are high in sensation seekers are those who like to skydive or bungee jump, rather than low sensation seekers whose preferred sensations likely end with a Swedish massage rather than a leap from a tall building. There is nothing wrong or ill about people on either side or any place on this trait spectrum. It's merely a measure of individual differences. For example, while I love horror, I also hate feeling nauseous, and as such, I have no desire whatsoever to jump out of an aircraft, even if it was in an intricate reenactment of the greatest scene of cinema ever recorded.
Big.
Anyway, individuals who soar high on the sensation-seeking instruments tend to be more likely to enjoy horror. We find this over and over again across actually various instruments of sensation-seeking. As I mentioned in the first video, there is a bit of a connection here between horror and further degeneracy appreciation, in that individuals who are also high in sensation-seeking tend to like horror more and are also more likely to enjoy pornography. See Lawrence and Palmgreen, 1996. Well, imagine my shock once again that people who like to experience many new things both enjoy being terrified and being pornified? It's really not a surprise, is it? People who dig horror are sensation seekers who desire high states of arousal, previously illustrated by Lawrence and Palmgreen themselves in 1991. Also, if you look at the fact that men tend to look at pornography more often than women, well, again, here comes that gender. Both men and women can be high in sensation seeking, but there is a gender difference in this factor once again, in that men just tend to be higher in sensation seeking in general. Look, it's really not complex. Women have every evolutionary reason to avoid dangerous situations, to avoid high sensation seeking, being the raisers and as base and sexist as it may sound to you, incubators of the human species. Women's role in society is honestly precisely why we have developed a culture around which women and children first within our mentality, in addition to the idea that men are expendable. All of this is based on a process of natural selection and our evolutionary social psychology. But again, while our biology is dictational, it is not determinational, which is precisely why a female such as myself can exist, a woman who loves to experience terror, despite that being at odds with my own evolution. I'm high in sensation seeking, at least when it comes to horror, and that's, you know what, that's just a quirk of my own individual identity, as we all have quirks of our own individual identity. It is not impossible, it's only really aberrant for the occasional woman to be high in sensation seeking. And hey, it also explains my love of pornography. At this last point though, I must explicate that a similar yet distinct faction, which is experience seeking, has been shown to be negatively associated with enjoyment of horror. Experience seekers are, well, without trying to be rude, along the lines of hedonism bot.
Hello, handsome. Might I procure your services?
What do I have to do?
Oh, nothing sordid, I assure you. Simply vomit on me ever so gently while I humiliate a pheasant.
In that, while sensation seeking can include aspects of experience seeking, and in fact does, pure, only experience seekers are mostly focused on social nonconformity, such as the induction of psychedelic drug use or interaction with non-normative individuals. Those who score high on experience seeking but not sensation seeking are less likely to enjoy horror. There are a myriad of other traits that then may help serve to explain why any one of us would be more or less drawn toward the spooky. Research indicates, for example, that younger individuals tend to enjoy horror more. See Lawrence and Palmgreen 1996 again. This makes a lot of sense in that younger people tend to be more interested in new experiences as they establish the sense of the self, while older humans are both more set in their ways and are less prone to adolescent risk-taking, given they are also more likely to be in the process of protecting or producing a family, all of which would discourage exposure to instances that would induce a fear response. Individuals higher in the big three dark triad negative personality trait of Machiavellianism, particularly in the propensity for deceit, are also more likely to enjoy horror, perhaps because they enjoy seeing others fail or suffer as a product of said personality trait. See Tamburini, Stiff, and Zillman 1987. This may be because high Mach individuals seek to defy some sort of social norms, and horror is of course once again inherently at odds with human nature of self-preservation. Further, there is, as I described in the previous video, a trait like susceptibility to boredom that is related to greater enjoyment of horror. That is, individuals who become bored more easily, and that is a trait, likely given that they are also high sensation seekers, this stuff all works in together, see, are more likely to want to see something that will arouse them out of their state of boredom, and as such are actually quite logically drawn to exciting forms of media, such as horror. If I've, for some reason in your opinion, been too nice and lenient towards horror lovers, given myself am among them, well then I need to also explain, if I did not enough by just describing the association with Machiavellianism, that yes, without question, horror fans do tend to have some of the more negative traits in general, and be more prone to other negative traits in relation to liking horror, including psychoticism, hostility, and aggression, as well as a general positive response to violent or negative images, and particularly among men, sometimes a greater propensity and liking of violence towards women, at least to see it within media, as well also as an interest in all kinds of various types of morbid events. There's all types of research on this. You can see Aluja-Fabregat 2000, Zaleski 1984, Tamburini, Stiff, and Zillman 1987, Zuckerman 1996. Yeah, it's not great, and it's also not really hard to imagine, given that men tend to be more aggressive and more hostile, while they also seek out higher arousal states and tend to therefore also like horror more, that maybe we would find this kind of association. Again, this doesn't have everything to do with men, it's just, well, these are general findings. It is, as I often say with social psychology though, kind of the no shit factor, but yeah, it's relatively consistent. And is it not, in truth, what you would expect? Yeah, people who are more aggressive, who are more hostile, who are more psychotic, enjoy horror more. Gee, what a surprise. That doesn't mean that everyone who likes horror has any single one of those traits, as I believe I have described in depth over the course of this video and every video I've ever done when I describe statistics. These are just averages. These are mere correlations. A correlation is not causation, as with anything I ever described. These are merely related elements. What I mean by that is, loving to have spooky, scary skeletons send shivers down your spine does not mean you are psychotic. It doesn't mean you're violent. It doesn't even mean you're aggressive. It merely means that, yeah, individuals who are more prone to psychoticism, to aggression, to hostility, to Machiavellianism are also more likely to enjoy horror. Honestly, unsurprisingly. I'm obviously not saying this is some form of condemnation because clearly it would therefore condemn me. It's just a statistical average finding. But on one last point, what about women? Outside of playing out an evolutionary theatrical representation of our social, psychological, gendered norms, or our individual proclivity towards sensation-seeking, why might it be that women enjoy horror films? I mean, they do. After all, I do. How could this genre really exist and be super financially profitable if it suited only a limited portion of the population and other portions only in very specific conditions? I mean, again, that can happen, but you do want to maximize your profits. Well, it may be because, as I mentioned in the last video, and we'll restate here, that we make social judgments of characters, and women are more likely to enjoy horror when there is a moral message or a justice-based outcome, while males experience more enjoyment based on the level of destruction they witness in the film. See Zillman, Stiff, and Tamburini 1987. This goes into Zillman's disposition theory, which evidence indicates affects all individuals differently based on their emphasis on empathy. This is why I hesitated to speak of moral judgments in the previous episode. I did mention it, but I hesitated, given that it teeters on the line between state and trait. As we know, focusing on empathy affects our moral judgments as it would affect our affective dispositional assessment of characters. That is, affective disposition theory is how individuals assess the morality or goodness or badness of a media figure based on a number of factors of input and analysis. As such, given women are more likely to enjoy horror when there is a just moral outcome, characters that are perceived as more just, as related to higher experience to empathy, may affect women to a greater extent and either increase or decrease their enjoyment of horror at large, outside of the general gender expression of co-viewership based on the film's outcomes. What I mean by that is that women tend to be more empathetic, and because they're more empathetic, they're more affected by disposition theory, and as such, their moral judgments of characters. Thus, films where the villain gets his, as horror villains do tend to be more commonly male, just desserts, and the liked protagonist survives, who tends to be more likely female, may be more enjoyed by women based on a higher likelihood of empathy. Yet, the opposite effect is also quite reasonable. It is also possible, in contrast, that the degree of similarity that women have to the victim, again more likely to be female, in an increase of parasocial liking and parasocial association, may explain why women actually like horror films less. Particularly given that in slasher films, females are far more likely to be the protagonists and the victims, and we may not see our typically male villain get his comeuppance. And with that, well, I think I've covered the majority of factors that describe why we may or may not like horror based on some of our inherent traits, or long-standing traits. I'm still not sure if I'm really gonna do a third video. I think I'd like to, because I have lots of shit to say about it. But if I do, it will be based on the overarching concepts of emotional stimuli, desensitization, coping strategies, and generally how horror, well, horrifies. If you guys can't tell, I have completely lost my voice over trying to do this video. I'm still suffering from this fucking shitty cold. So, I would really appreciate that if you enjoyed this video for you to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.
Planet Earth, about to be retired. Your only chance to survive or do that is to leave with us. Now,